Hi, welcome everyone to our training for Energy Innovator Fellows today on transportation electrification. Next slide, please. Nancy Ryan with NER Consulting will start off with an introduction to transportation electrification. She'll take a break in the middle. And then we'll have Andy Satchwell with Berkeley Lab talking about electric vehicle rate design. Please go ahead and enter your questions at any time in the chat box. We're going to have Q&A following each presenter. I've got the link for the slides. I'll put it in the chat box. And a recording will be posted soon at the same site. Next slide. All right, Dr. Nancy Ryan, she's spent her career working in the public and private sectors. She's worked for the California Public Utilities Commission, both as a commissioner and an advisor to the president, among other duties. She taught applied economics at UC Berkeley. She has worked in the consulting field for a while, and she works today with a lot of the the industry. So she has a really good perspective from both the regulatory and private industry background. Andy Satchwell is one of our own. He is a staff scientist and deputy leader in the Energy Markets and Policy Department at Berkeley Lab. He focuses on financial analysis of electric utility regulatory and business models, but he works on a lot of other things as well. He previously worked for the Indiana Consumer Advocate, where he served as an expert economics and policy witness on behalf of ratepayers. Next slide. All right, I want to remind everyone, we just had our training last week in Charlotte, the first of our training series, and I think it was great. And we have two more coming up. If you missed the first one, we have one in Detroit on March 11th and 12th, and you can register now for that. We also have one coming up in Denver. We changed both location and the date slightly. So it's in Denver, April 30th and May 1st. Registration will be available soon. If you are working at a public utility commission, state energy office, or utility consumer advocate office, you can get a travel stipend to attend. Please reach out before making your travel arrangements so that you can go ahead and register right away. We had something new this time. We also had office hours with trainers, which was a big hit, as you can see here in the picture. And we also have a half-day state action planning workshop facilitated with RMI to help you apply the learnings to developing plans for advancing distribution planning in your state. Next slide, please. And here are a list of other resources for you, including we have new technical assistance now. If you're working on transmission planning at your agency, we have new technical assistance available to states on FERC Order 1920. All right, let's get started with our first presenter, Nancy Ryan.
Okay. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, as the case may be. Thanks for tuning in. I am going to ask for a little forbearance because I have a cold I picked up at the training in Charlotte last week. So hence the break right in the middle of my talk, even if it's not an ideal break point, just to give my voice a rest. So let's see. Miles, next slide, please. So here's what I'll be covering. First of all, just a few basics, some terminology, and kind of an overview of the different types of vehicles. Then we'll go to an overview of the market for EVs and some of the forces or the principal forces that are driving adoption. I'll then talk about, well, what does this have to do with utilities and public utility commissions? So differing perspectives and examples of the utility role in supporting EV adoption. Then I'll turn to the all-important and increasingly challenging question of how to plan to serve EV charging loads. And then finally talk about some tools, data sources, and policy solutions to help cost-effectively integrate EVs into the grid. So Miles, go ahead and skip. Go ahead to, yeah. So let's start with some classifications. So there are lots of different types of EVs. They come in many shapes and sizes. And these are the conventional This is the conventional classification system used in the transportation world to classify cars, trucks, buses, and various types of service vehicles. So light duty or LDVs are class 1 and class 2A. So part of that second array on the left, and that encompasses cars, light trucks, SUVs, and some small vans. Then class 2B, so the bigger class 2 vehicles, plus 3, 4, and 5, go under the heading of medium duty vehicles, or MDVs, you'll hear me call them. So that's the box trucks and UPS vans that you see running around cities, kind of smaller shuttle buses. And then finally, the last and biggest class is, or not the, well, biggest in size, and you'll see big in other respects as well, are the heavy duty EVs. So many of these are really kind of specialized vehicles like tow trucks, refuse trucks, fire trucks, cement trucks. But I think the biggest numbers are the class 8 trailers, semi-rigs that you see hauling containers and other kinds of trailers on the highway, crisscrossing the country, or in town sometimes as well. The medium and heavy duty vehicles typically can charge either what we can charge at home on level 1 or level 2. I'll do those definitions on the next slide. Medium duty vehicles have really big batteries and the kinds of duty cycles or vocations that typically require them to charge with DC charging, sometimes very fast. And the other thought I want to leave you with about medium and heavy duty vehicles, I'll come back to that, is like these are working industrial equipment, exactly equivalent in the minds of business owners and operators to machines on factory floors. They do a job on a often very fixed schedule and are purchased for different reasons than typically people buy light duty vehicles and make their choices and decide whether or not to buy an EV for lots of different reasons. So we'll get into that. But anyway, I want to really impress that upon you, because that's really critical, that we need to think about light duty vehicles differently than medium and heavy duty vehicles. And as Lisa said, I do work a lot with the private sector now, both with the trade association that serves almost all the manufacturers of light duty vehicles in the US, and with a trade association that serves the medium and heavy duty vehicles and the various companies that build them, charge them, and use them in fleets. So I can tell you from that personal experience that they're very different industries, and we'll get into that as well. Okay, next slide, Miles. So charging basics, this is really, probably familiar to most of you, and just some terminology. So AC charging level 1 is just plug it into a standard outlet, sometimes called trickle charging. Level 2, if you've got a dryer outlet in your garage, you can, I think, plug directly into that or kind of stick a charger on it. Level 2 chargers are sometimes smart chargers. You sometimes also see level 2 chargers, and they're pretty common in public. DC fast charging, started out at something like 34 kW. Today, they go up to 1 megawatt. We will see the what's called the megawatt charging system, or MWS CS debut in public next year. The most visible DC fast chargers are the Tesla superchargers, which again were originally around 50 kW, but the biggest ones today, I think, are actually 400 kW. So, while level 1 and level 2 at home are, or sometimes in public, are fine for, the majority of personal vehicles charging needs, en route charging for all classes of vehicles, and even depot charging for medium and heavy duty vehicles is typically DC fast charging, and faster. But again, the optimal charging solution for any given fleet really, depends on how the vehicles in that fleet are used. Next slide. Andy will talk more about this, but I wanted to just flag one thing. how do we meter charging load? Well, actually, one other thing I should say is that public charging, provided by companies like Electrify America, Tesla, or like Mercedes-Benz at Buc-ee's service plazas, if some of you have seen those. Those are typically not regulated, even though they're effectively selling electricity. They are not regulated as utilities. They are regarded as unregulated entities that are selling charging services. And that load, like every other load, has to be metered. So in a home or in a commercial setting, the metering may be done. It just may be recorded on the along with the rest of the loads at the site on the meter for the site. Sometimes, definitely in commercial settings, and occasionally in home settings, there may be a dedicated meter for the EV. This is typically linked with the type of rate the EV served on. And again, I think Andy and I will have more to say about that. There are technologies both embedded in the meters themselves, the level 2, what are called smart meters, that have intelligence and comms capabilities. I think pretty much all DC fast chargers. And in vehicles themselves, there's, the sensing and communications capability that makes it possible to submeter the EV's charging load by those means. And again, that will be relevant in the context of rates. Okay, so next slide. What I want to do now for like the next, I don't know, like probably 10 or 15 minutes is really give you an overview of the market for EVs. Again, talk about some of the distinctions between the forces driving and the factors that animate purchases of light-duty personal vehicles versus the light, medium, and light, occasionally, and mostly medium and heavy-duty vehicles that comprise fleets. So next slide, please. Okay, so some of the things these industries have in common are they're low margin industries, very long product development cycle. All the OEMs is what automakers and truck makers call themselves. It stands for original equipment manufacturers. They are global enterprises. They typically, the big ones, operate all around the world. China, competition with China, or their access to markets in China, or to components and minerals that come from China, are controlled by China, are like everyday, often worrisome factors that, keep executives at these companies up at night. That long product development cycle is important because it's longer than the political cycle. And as you know, EVs have become a bit of a political football these days and are buffeted by the political forces. But the people who run these companies and develop the vehicles, they need to ride out this cyclical cycle, the political cycle as well as economic cycles. And I'll say more about that. So that's what they have in common. Light duty vehicles, uniquely, they're really mainly a consumer good. You think about all the ads you see on TV, they appeal very much to emotions, aspirations, whether it's, safety for your kids driving to the soccer game, or that one day you might want to go camping in the wilderness. Those are the kinds of things that animate many of these sales. Not to say that many people aren't, practical and dollars and cents oriented. I also want to note that particularly for the big automakers, so Ford, GM, and Stellantis, which comprises like the Dodge, Chrysler, and other familiar old brands. Those companies in particular, I think probably Toyota for sure as well, maybe Nissan, about 20% of their sales are actually to fleets. If you think about the vehicles that run around, the cars that run around, like vector control in my neighborhood, the vector control lady goes around, woman goes around in a Prius, or the cars that deliver and pick up samples from doctors' offices. So this is a big market. Just in the US, there's about 15 million cars and light trucks sold annually. Relatively small number of people buy or lease most new cars. And then, as you know, cars have second, third, fourth owners over the course of their approximately 17-year lifespan. Cars and light trucks last a lot longer than they used to. They have long lifespans. Medium and heavy duty vehicles, different buyers. They're all sold to fleets. Fleets could be, like in the tens of thousands, like Amazon and UPS and FedEx, or, in the, ones and twos and threes, like, a company that delivers seafood, or clean linens to, restaurants in the city. So fleets are immensely varied in their composition, the duty cycle of the vehicles, the vocation. In other words, the thing the vehicle does every day. Some vehicles do the same thing every day, like delivering napkins to white tablecloth restaurants. Some vehicles that carry freight, and are quite versatile. They may drive a short haul one day and a long haul the next day. So they're very diverse. That's the thing you have to remember. The key factor, and I'll say more about this, the key factor in the vehicle purchase is the total cost of ownership. And that is also true for the decision to convert from a conventional diesel or internal combustion engine vehicle and to start incorporating EVs in the fleet. So I'll have more to say about that. Medium and heavy duty vehicle sales, ride with the business cycle, and sometimes the fluctuations in sales of these vehicles are amplified relative to the business cycle. So currently there has been a kind of a 2-year downturn for trucks, that followed, some of the best years they've had forever. If you think about, the burst in online shopping that came, as a result of COVID. The other thing to note is that while cars are, mass produced, and with very little customization, that's largely pretty superficial. Every single truck you have to think of every single truck as a custom product that is made to order for a particular fleet operator, and in one way or another, whether it is customized to serve the needs of that fleet. As an example, I used to live in the Berkeley Hills. That's where the view is behind me. And the garbage trucks, the refuse trucks that serve that neighborhood have a short wheelbase because the roads are so windy. And, not very many refuse companies are going to require something like that. So anyway, that's kind of some framing to think about the market. Next slide. So regardless of what you may have heard about, EVs are toast, or we've reached peak EV, the reality is that the EV market has been growing steadily for the last several years. It has been approximately, mostly flat, although I think there was a little bit of an uptick in the last quarter. Obviously, it's being buffeted by some, significant headwinds and a high degree of uncertainty right now. And this is just the U.S. If we were looking at the top right-hand chart is just sales in the U.S. over the last 5 years. Each bar is a quarter. If we were to look at global sales, you would see a much higher decline, and a lot of that's driven by China, and again drives the sleepless nights for executives at all the automakers. The market share of EVs has grown steadily in the U.S. As the market share for gasoline-powered vehicles has declined. The bottom right corner of the chart there is from Edison Electric Institute's periodic forecast of EV sales and an effort to project charging infrastructure needs. And what you see there, all the different lines are several different forecasts from, I think, commercial forecasting outfits that they looked at to come up with their own consensus forecast, which is the heavier dotted line, that's black dotted line that's kind of in the middle. And of note is the lighter dotted line that corresponds, or that mostly overlaps, the blue lowest forecast by PricewaterhouseCoopers on the bottom. That's their 2022 forecast of adoption. So they have significantly upped their expectations for the rate of EV adoption in their most recent forecast, published just about 6 weeks ago. The biggest factor that is weighing on EV adoption is the still the kind of dearth of charging infrastructure. And as I'll discuss, there's a lot in the works as a result of investments that were made or are now being made with funding from the bipartisan infrastructure bill. That's very, there's a lot in the pipeline. Next slide, please. But before we get to that, I wanted to say that, I'll talk about the state level regulations and the federal regulation that are driving EV sales in the US in a few minutes. But excuse me. This is, EVs are being sold in every state. These are the market shares from the Auto Industries, the Auto Industries Principal Trade Association. They publish a quarterly outlook, and these are market shares as of the second quarter of 2024. Sorry. So you can see, California, for lots of reasons, has the highest market share at close to 26% for EVs. And the states and all the states other than Hawaii in the left-hand column are states that have adopted California's regulations. More on that later, and into the second column. But I want to just flag for you that there are some other states that are not so-called ZEV states that also have seen pretty significant big states that have seen pretty significant penetrations of EVs, including Florida, Illinois, Georgia, and Texas is Texas is right in the middle of the pack. And although these percentages are much lower than some of the West Coast states, these are big states where there are lots of cars and they tend to be concentrated in cities. So it's important for each of you, no matter where you're located, to get a sense of what that market looks like where you live. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to turn to talking about giving you kind of some more context for medium and heavy duty vehicles. And this is really interesting because if you look at this first column here, and these are actually a little bit, they're from an article that was published this year by some of Lisa and Andy's colleagues at the lab and at DOE, I think. They're about 5 years old, but I think that they're, more or less, accurate today. So if you look at the first column, that's the entire stock of medium and heavy duty vehicles in the US. So note that like the total stock of medium and heavy duty vehicles in the US is less than the total number of light duty vehicles sold in each year. So big difference in scale. Also note that if you read up from the bottom, classes 7 and 8, the heavy duty vehicles, they account for, about a third of the total fleet of medium and heavy duty vehicles that are on the road in the US, with the rest being medium, split approximately evenly between class 3, so like vans and local delivery, last mile delivery kind of vehicles, and then various types of medium duty vehicles. But go to the next column and you look at like the vehicle miles traveled, VMT, and you see like the heavy duty trucks drive a whole lot more. And part of that is because they are very expensive capital assets, and the incentive is to keep them running as many hours as possible. They're also the trucks like the Class 8, again, the Class 8 tractors, as they're called, the semi-rigs that haul containers and trailers. Those are the trucks that drive the long haul, that really clock, they can clock them easily 100,000 miles in a year. Yeah, sorry, hung myself up there. Okay, and then the last thing to note is like because they drive so much and because they are so heavy and are hauling heavy loads, those heavy duty class 7 and 8 vehicles also account for an even more disproportionate share of CO2 emissions relative to the miles that they drive. So big impact, and hence, even though they are in many ways the hardest to electrify, they also are the most important to electrify from a climate perspective. Next slide, please. So as I showed you several slides ago when I gave you presented the classification system, There are lots and lots of different types of medium and heavy duty trucks and buses and vans, and that do lots of different things and have lots of different kinds of vocations. And the different sort of use case combination of technology and use cases for those medium and heavy duty vehicles are at different stages of maturity. There are EV options, electric drive options, sometimes also fuel cell options, which are electric drive. There are electrified options for every single category, but they are at different stages of commercial maturity and different stages of their total cost of ownership, and capacity to execute particular vocations, relative to their conventional counterparts. And what you see here, these are some statistics from CalSTART, which is a great source of information also about medium and heavy duty vehicles. What you see here is their, I think, quarterly or semi-annual stats on vehicle cumulative deployments of zero emission trucks. So that's what ZET is. And what you see here is that like the fleet of zero emission trucks on the roads in the US is dominated by cargo vans. That's the Amazon delivery van that runs up and down my street every day, and maybe some of yours. And to some extent, this is a reflection of like, this is an ideal technology and vocation for early electrification. These vehicles don't drive very many miles a day. Most of them are idle overnight and sit at the depot and can charge at level 2. They start and stop a lot, which means that the regenerative braking will help recharge the battery. And then you've got companies like FedEx and Amazon that have made, various types of decarbonization commitments, and so they're snapping these up. The second biggest category, and this might seem ironic and perplexing in light of what I just said, are Class 8, what are called yard tractors. So these are semi rigs, but these ones are typically not driving on highways or not driving much distance on highways. They're doing what's called drayage, which is hauling containers around at the port and like picking up a container at the port and taking it to a nearby warehouse or to a multimodal facility where maybe it gets on a train and goes somewhere. These have also been, they're also a good target for early electrification, even though they're the heavy duty technology, because again, they don't drive a lot of miles during the day. They start and stop a lot, and they operate close to people. So the ports, at least on the West Coast, where obviously like things are very driven by regulation, the ports of Long Beach and LA, which are the two biggest ports in the US and handle a huge percentage. I'm sorry, I don't have the number of, the cargo that comes into the US. They're all close to, residential neighborhoods, often, low income neighborhoods, and hence have been a priority for California air quality regulators to electrify. And I will say, I was just at a facility at the Port of Long Beach a couple of weeks ago, which has been built to do DC fast charging for these drayage tractors performing drayage services. And they come in, they can charge up in half an hour and go back to work and haul in containers around the port. And I was stunned when one of them rolled past me, and it was as silent as a Prius. And if you know what it's like to stand next to an idling or moving diesel truck, it was really stunning. I won't say it almost ran me over because I was paying a lot of attention in that yard because there were a lot of trucks moving around, but I was still stunned by how quiet it was. Okay, so that's the state of technology. Next slide, please. Again, I'll say more about the total cost of ownership, but obviously there's two key factors: the cost of the truck and the cost of whatever's fueling the truck, whether it's diesel fuel, hydrogen, or electricity. Those are the two key ingredients to total cost of ownership, which is again, the principal factor that fleet operators look at after they've determined that an electric drive truck can do the work. And you can see that the deployments have taken off in the left-hand chart. I mean, the numbers are still quite small, but remember also the stock is quite small. The other thing that I think is interesting, if you look at the deployments of medium and heavy duty trucks across the country, again, they're not just in these blue states, which are the ones that have adopted California's advanced clean trucks regulation. More to come on that. And some of the numbers are pretty big, even, like in Texas. Like Texas is second only to California in terms of the number of medium and heavy duty zero emission truck deployments. And that really reflects the fact that Texas has very cheap electricity and is a huge center for, just a lot of freight crisscrosses Texas. If you've ever been to Plano outside of Dallas, you will see more warehouses there than just about any place you've ever been in your life. That's, you don't think you don't have to think about electric trucks just because you're not on the coast or in a ZEV state. I think that's the takeaway here. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I've alluded a lot to various forces driving transportation electrification. So now I'll talk about those in a little bit more organized way with a little bit more detail. So next slide, please. So I would say that, across the board, light, medium, and heavy duty, it is definitely still the case that environmental regulation in the US, in Europe, China, is very much still the principal driver. This is absolutely, a policy-driven market. These markets are driven by public policy, which includes, and I'll say more about this, public sector and utility investment, principally in charging infrastructure and to some extent in grid infrastructure. But I think that is changing. For some, again, we saw there's different levels of maturity for different types of vehicles. And, we're really at a tipping point for some of them. Okay, so then, on the demand side for fleets, corporate sustainability commitments, I already talked about that a little bit, driving particularly demand for cargo, last mile delivery vehicles. Consumer demand, most people who buy an EV buy another EV. The Wall Street Journal likes to talk about the small fraction who don't buy another EV, but, there's a lot more on the other side of the scale. So for many people, it's an attractive choice. And, and even from an economics point of view, again, if you live in a place with cheap electricity. Global market forces, I've already talked about China. China, it's not just environmental regulation, concern about air quality in cities and climate. It's also, the product of a very, forceful and concerted industrial policy, suite of policies to drive an industrial policy. Then, as vehicle capabilities improve, the range, the charging time for trucks, the load they can carry, all of those are driving electrification. So just basically better technology, steady improvement in technology. And finally, savings in the, again, the total cost of ownership, or some people refer to it as total cost of driving. One other thing I want to say before I move on is I was at an event that the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, which is the principal trade association for light-duty manufacturers, all the big legacy makers. I was at an event they had for the financial community recently. I mean, in every other sentence, China was the subject of the sentence. And what was interesting was that a few people noted, it used to be you'd go to China and the vehicles they were producing were cheap and abundant, but not very good. They said, that's not true anymore. The vehicles that are being produced in China are excellent, sophisticated EVs that, will give, some of the best European and American, North American produced vehicles a run for their money. And we better invest and speed up to catch up with them, because they also have a much faster product development cycle there than is typical in the West. So anyway, that's what sort of global market forces is shorthand for that. But it's not just a race for numbers of vehicles; it's a race for quality and capabilities. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about emission regulations in the U.S. This is going to be a big topic next year, and for the next few years, it's going to be battle royal between the new administration and California in particular. Some of you may have been reading about that. So just some context for that. So on the light duty front, the principal regulation is called Advanced Clean Cars 2. Due to interesting historical details I don't have time to go into, California is allowed to set its own emissions regulations, its own tailpipe regulations, and other states under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act are allowed to opt into California standards. So in the top right-hand corner of that map, the green colored states are states that have opted into the ACC2 program and account for between a third and a half of all light-duty vehicle sales in the U.S. Hence, there's a big target on ACC2 because vehicle manufacturers really only want one standard, and they would rather have it be, excuse me, a less aggressive standard. So we'll see what happens. ACC2 so there's also an EPA standard that was adopted under the Biden administration. Those go under a different name, and they refer to both the conventional pollutants, NOx, particulate matter, and volatile organic gases. All those things come out of the tailpipe as well as the CO2, hence the moniker multi-pollutant standards. The auto industry has come out and said, if we'd like one standard, it should be from the EPA, and it shouldn't be as rigorous as it is. It's on the absolute edge of what's technically attainable, is their language. Stellantis, which again I think is probably the third largest U.S. maker now, they have an agreement with the California Air Resources Board that they'll comply with ACC2 even if the new administration is successful in vitiating the standards. The other big ones had an agreement with CARB about ACC2's predecessor, the ZEV program, or Advanced Clean Cars 1, but that expires next year. If you look at the chart in the middle, that indicates kind of what's involved for OEMs, automakers, to comply with Advanced Clean Cars 1 and then 2. So the left-hand segment is the percentage of EVs that each manufacturer had to sell through 2026 to comply with ACC1. And then you can see the second half of the chart with a steeper line. That's what they're expected to sell under ACC2. So get up to 100% ZEV sales by 2030 or 2035. Sorry, 100% ZEV sales by 2035. This is what's frequently referred to as the ban on gasoline-powered vehicles. It's not a ban on owning one, but it is an effective ban on selling one selling one for the first time in the new car market as of 2035. So it's very aggressive. Most manufacturers do not meet it now. Tesla meets it. It's a credit-based system, and so Elon Musk has made a lot of money selling credits to the other automakers and stands to make a whole lot more if ACC2 persists. Different suite of regulations for medium and heavy-duty vehicles. Advanced Clean Trucks is what that is known as. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner the states that have adopted the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation. Similar to ACC2, it's based on percentage of vehicles sold, so it's basically trying to drive the supply side to make the truck manufacturers develop a suite of appealing medium and heavy duty vehicles that fleets will choose to buy because they can do the work and pencil out. But California has also developed the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation, which today is only in California, and ACF is intended to be a demand push. So to require fleets that operate in California to have a growing share of the fleet be comprised of zero-emission vehicles. And this is the subject of a lawsuit from about a little more than half the Republican attorneys general who are suing and saying this is de facto mandate to buy, that will drive up the cost of moving freight in our states, because if a fleet has any trucks that operate in California, then this applies to the fleet. And so we'll see how that works out. There are also, again, federal standards for trucks, what's called the Phase 3 GHG standards. I will note that unlike the current or the soon-to-be current state of affairs for the auto industry, all of the major truck manufacturers in the US. So that's Daimler North America, Volvo Group, International, which used to be known as Navistar. They make all the familiar brands like Mack and Peterbilt that you see on the highways. They and a bunch of other companies, some of the major like GM and Ford, some of the companies that make a lot of medium duty vehicles, basically giant pickup trucks and vans, they all have an MOU with the CARB, the California Air Resources Board, that they will continue to comply with ACT, Advanced Clean Trucks, even if court or other federal action renders CARB unable to support it. So that is really pretty impervious. Advanced Clean Fleets, we'll see about that. Anyway, so that's the regulatory picture in the US. Next slide, please. So that the air quality regulation. So turning to your world, public utility commissions, there is more than half the states, about a third of the states, have permitted investor-owned utilities to invest in some aspect of supporting zero-emission vehicle adoption. And that might be doing pilots with TOU rates where, somebody gets a free level 2 charger if they opt in to a TOU rate that gets them to charge at night. Andy will have more to say about this. But in a number of states, commissions have authorized IOUs to buy and install charging infrastructure, sometimes to own and operate it, other times to do what's called a make ready, to do all the upgrades at the customer site to make it possible. So that's like the panel, the conduit, and so on and so forth, to do all the upgrades at the site that makes it possible to put EV chargers at the site. And then they sometimes will also offer a rebate for the customer to buy the charger. So over $5 billion has been approved for those kinds of programs. About a little less than a third is in California. A lot of that money is still being dispersed, although we're not really seeing utilities ask for funds now. They're, as I'll say later, many of them are panicking about like, oh, wait, what about our side of the grid? We have to upgrade that. And that, that's probably where our CapEx should go. In addition, some states have offered vehicle, tax credits or outright payments as vehicle purchase incentives, or, hand out money for installation of EV charging infrastructure, either sometimes for people at home, but also, use public funds to build public charging. In California, the funding for that, not surprisingly, dwarfs the federal funding that rolls into the state. I'll say something about that in a sec. But anyway, that's part of why you see like such a high EV market share in California, because there has been, sustained investment in EV charging, public charging in California for years. Okay, and then the other big source, and this has been a huge boon over the during the Biden administration, particularly over the last couple of years, as it's started to trickle into the marketplace, is the funding approved under the bipartisan infrastructure bill, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA. As well as the so that paid for, put out $7.5 billion for charging infrastructure to be dispersed by the states, and a lot of that money is now in the pipeline. It took a while to get that system up and running, but that money is in the pipeline. It's a formula program where every state is authorized to gets a piece of the pie, and red and blue states alike have raced for the money. The very first chargers that opened were in Ohio. There are also tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act. They're in the crosshairs. They may go away. But that has been a big, been a big booster. And EPA, and I think also Department of Transportation, they have handed out, significant grants for vehicle purchases, like particularly like the Clean School Bus program. So a lot of funding has flowed. We'll see how that picture changes over time, but know that particularly for charging infrastructure, there's a lot of money in the pipeline that has not yet turned into steel in the ground. And that money, several $1 billion, that money is definitely not going away. So we will start to see, more and more charging stations open based on that money. And their Atlas Public Policy has a pretty nifty website with maps that you can look at to see both what's in the pipeline and what's open. I don't have a link in here, but if anybody's interested, you can message me. Next slide, please. So I've talked about this a lot already, but again, once it's clear to a fleet operator that a ZEV can fulfill that fleet's vocation, whether it's hauling garbage or deodorant and diapers and dog food, once they're satisfied that it can fulfill the vocation, and they can get grid capacity for charging, then they're going to look at the total cost of ownership. Is it cheaper over its life compared to the conventional alternative? And there are many studies, and this is an example of one that was, again, done by some of the folks from DOE in the lab. ICCT, International Council for Clean Transportation, they also do, very good studies. So, this continuing effort to look at, how is the race for what's called TCO parity. So when a ZEV or ZET costs as much to own and operate over its lifetime as a conventional vehicle. Because once you hit that parity, again, if the vehicle can do the job, then you're at the tipping point for fleets. And, as I said, that's probably the case. It is the case, I think, for last mile delivery, and it will be the case, over time for more vehicles. And if you look at the chart on the right, this is, I'll leave that for you to look at later, or you can read the paper. It's a great paper. But it just shows kind of, in terms, in the vertical chart, what's the CO2 impact of different classes of vehicles. You can see from, pickups to medium duty to, big trucks, with the big trucks in the top right-hand corner. And then sort of how far are they away from TCO parity? So, again, you see those smaller trucks, at parity now, but the big ones that really have the impact on CO2, that's coming, by the mid 2030s, that's coming. And it will be the case for some individual fleets today. So, that's kind of the overall picture. So remember that, again, every fleet is a snowflake. If you've seen one fleet, you've seen one fleet. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I'm not going to dwell on this, but this is a big confusing kind of eye chart. It's from the same paper as the diagram on the last slide. What I want to point to here is that each row corresponds to a class. So top row, class 3, that's like, pretty small trucks and vans, class 4 through 6. Second row, that's the medium duty kind of box trucks and the like. Class 7, 8, that's the heavy duty vehicles. The first column is how the sales share evolves over time as that type of vehicle, reaches TCO parity. And the thing I want to point out to you is how steep it gets when that TCO parity line is crossed. So the sales share of, so the yellow part, yellow and orange, the sales share of the zero emission trucks, rises very, very fast. And then if you look at the second column, their share of the stock, goes up obviously more slowly, but pretty quickly. Paradoxically, why is this true? Paradoxically, trucks last a long time. They can be driven like 1 million miles or more. I'm sure there are trucks, tractors that are, doing drayage at the ports. That's where the oldest ones typically wind up, that are approaching 20 years old. But the fleets that buy the trucks new from the manufacturers, they only keep them on average 3 to 5 years. So, and then they stay in circulation for a long time. So that quick turnover by those first purchasers is going to be what drives how fast they're adopted. So the takeaway, for you as at energy regulatory agencies, again, is that this load can show up really fast, and add to that the cycle to like buy a truck and bring it into the fleet is, less than a year for these businesses, can be, just a few months. And a big charging hub, and I'll talk about what big is, can be built in 12 to 18 months, much faster in other states and many other states than in California, where permitting is, endlessly vexatious. But so, the punchline should probably be underlined, is grid planners need to be ready because this load can show up really fast. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let's pause for a poll. And yeah, Lisa, and Miles, I don't actually know how the poll works. Oh, there we go. Okay, so would you seriously consider an EV as your next car? Yes, no, or I already drive one. So take a minute to answer the question, and and then we'll see, and we'll talk about why and why not.
All right, you should be able to see the results here.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, cool. All right, let me see a hand from somebody who already drives an EV. Raise your hand, and let's see, Miles, can you see? I can't see who has their hand up. Or actually, just if you already drive an EV, drop in the chat your name and why you made that decision, and then I'll just read a few of the answers. Well, actually, you can just read the answers. Yeah, so if you already drive an EV, actually, sorry, I'm making this up on the fly. In the chat, write your answer, yes, no, or already, and then why. So why did I buy one? Why would I buy one? Why won't I buy one? Drop it in the chat, and then we'll take it from there. Because this kind of leads into the next part of the talk.
Nancy,
All right, and I'm not.
May need some time to do that. Why don't we move on and we can go to this?
Yeah, okay, great. No problem. Okay, yeah, so while you're thinking about that, let's go to the next slide. So I want to talk now about the utility role in supporting EV adoption, and I think your answers will kind of inform this discussion some. But meanwhile, why don't I do a little background for those of you maybe who are not working at commissions or are pretty new. So next slide, please. So every state has a public utility commission. They go by different names, from Board of Public Utilities to Illinois Commerce Commission, but every state has a appointed or elected body that regulates the utility industries, water, to some extent, telecommunications. That industry is largely deregulated today. Gas, always electricity, although in different ways and to varying degrees, whether or not the state's restructured. Sometimes other industries. When I went to work at the California PUC in 2006, we still regulated hot air balloons, and the PUC still regulates airport limos, and hence the California PUC was the first regulator to really regulate Uber, and whether or not they have authority over some of those other industries really varies from state to state. So PUCs are responsible for assuring there is, safe, reliable, affordable electric service. In some states, it's also clean electric service, based upon whatever definition is operative in that state. Critically, every PUC oversees rate cases, sometimes called GRCs, general rate cases, or multi-year rate cases. Utilities are subject. I'm sure you'll have a whole other class on rate of return regulation, but essentially the commission determines how much cost can be recovered from customers for utilities capital and operating budgets, and how those costs are divided up among commercial, industrial, residential, and other classes of customers, and what kind of structure what kind of form rates will take to recover those costs. And often PUC commissions, sometimes in varying degrees of partnership with ratepayer advocates, with state energy offices, will also oversee renewable portfolio standards, storage mandates, energy efficiency, investments in EV charging infrastructure, which I want to come to next. So that cues up. Let's see. So I've got some good answers here. Reese says, yes, I will consider purchasing an EV for my next vehicle, as I've been impressed with the increased range and charging infrastructure build out. So yeah, the technology is improving, and there's going to be charging infrastructure, and utilities play a role in the latter. John K says, no, I don't drive enough. My car is fully depreciated, and I like to be able to repair my own car. So yeah, those come down to economics, and fundamentally economics. Yeah, I mean, new cars are so complicated. I mean, the reason it costs so much to repair your car after a fender bender is because the bumper is like stuffed with cameras and sensors, which certainly not true in a 17-year-old car. Colorado, Colton says, yeah, I would buy one. Colorado has great incentives and rebates that make the upfront costs lower. I'm not sure what the utility rebates there, but Colorado has been pretty aggressive on supporting EVs. And yeah, then I see Tamar said, yeah, I already drive one. I knew I wanted to get one, and the tax credit was really a big incentive. Some people say they bought one for Haley, bought one for environmental and economic reasons, liked the incentives. And yeah, and then Hannah says, well, I'd like to buy one, but I'm renting my home, so I don't know how I'd charge. This is a big problem, and something that has been a focus of public utility commissions. I'm like, let's see, where is he? I'm kind of like John Kay, in that I have a fully depreciated 8-year-old car that I drive about 5,000 miles a year, and I would love to drive an EV and walk the walk, but I don't need a new car, and I'm hoping I never don't have to buy another one for years and years. So people have different reasons, and some of them have to do with the utility, what the utility can do. Okay, so thanks for your responses. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so some of the ways that EVs, that utilities can support TE, and some of the focus points of some of these programs I mentioned before, the $5+ billion that utilities are spending. EVs can help promote adoption by actually deploying and operating charging infrastructure, or supporting deployment of it. There have also been programs to give incentives to dealers so that their salesmen will be motivated to sell EVs. The sort of scuttlebutt, or common perception, is that EVs don't like to that dealers don't want to sell EVs because they have way fewer moving parts than conventional vehicles, and there's less revenue for them in the future, for everything from oil changes to replacing cylinder heads in their shops, which is where they actually make their money. Limited awareness, info, enthusiasm. I think that with so many new models, there's nearly 120 light duty models available today. I think, and lots of advertisements for EVs. I think we're turning the corner, at least on awareness. And then, as a number of people noted, upfront cost, premium versus conventional vehicles. Most, there've been a few utility programs and a few more proposed that were denied by the commissions that would actually help with the purchase cost, or at least buy it down by paying for the charger. That's it's really the charging infrastructure that has been the main focus of the utility programs. Utilities have argued for years that you can't make any money selling kilowatt hours to drivers. And so therefore utilities should get to own and operate, basically utilities should be in this business. And they persuaded some commissioners of that. I think Andy's going to talk about that more. The other thing that's on the utilities plate, and therefore their regulators' plate, is integration. And I will have more to, say about that, both, managing loads to minimize the cost, the need to upgrade the grid and those costs. And then also kind of proactively shaping charging loads to help with particularly integrating solar power, really trying to shift, provide people incentives that get them to shift load to, various times of day that are when there's a lot of solar power and it's relatively cheap, or, again, in the case of California, we're, effectively dumping it in other states, paying them to take it away. So, why not pay someone to take it away in their EV than, pay Oregon to take it from us? Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I believe this slide is actually borrowed from Andy, and I will just note that, with regard to utilities engaging, particularly in providing or supporting charging, there's really three main models. So the top set of bars, the standard model, that the point of demarcation should kind of be right in the middle of a meter. I think it got lost in translation from the slide this came from. But, basically the utility pays for everything on its side of the meter. They may actually assess some cost, particularly on commercial customers, for whatever grid upgrades they have to do on their side of the meter. But the customer is responsible for, paying for everything that's on, on their side of the meter, including buying and maintaining the charger. And paying, if it's in commercial use, like at the grocery store, paying some company to do the settlements. The make-ready model, which many, many states have adopted, and which I personally favor. You can ask me a question when we get to Q&A about why that is. But the make-ready model, the utility will pay for, everything on its side of the meter, plus the upgrades at the customer site, and possibly provide a rebate for a charger that's on an approved list of chargers that the utility has tested and vetted. And then the customer pays the rest. Usually there's at least some copay to make sure the customer really wants it. The customer pays for the rest. Let's see. All right, I'm going to answer, Jessica. I'm going to answer your question in a minute, but let me. Then the last model is, that utilities in some states have been authorized to do, or has been, or utilities have been limited to doing in areas that are considered to be underserved. Either there's a lot of renters, it's a low income area, it's generally adjudged to be an area where commercial EV operators like charging providers like EVgo or Electrify America won't go. Then you can have the utility, owning and operating and taking responsibility for maintaining the charging infrastructure in places, again, where it's considered that there's not a strong business case. All right, so we're coming up on the break, and what I think what I'm going to do is look at your questions over the break, and then I'll answer those questions before I continue with the topic of vehicle grid integration. So, Lisa, I think we're breaking for 10 minutes, so we'll go till 15 past the hour. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, great. So thanks for your attention, and I'll come back with answers and some more content. Oh. Okay, so yeah, we had a very good question from Jessan before the break, which actually got a very good answer from Andy in the chat. So Jessan asked about conversations around the potential risk of gentrification with the rollout of EV charging in rented homes or lower income areas. And I will say that is a concern that I have heard raised often in California. And the solution tendered, I don't know how effective it is, and maybe the report that Andy references can shed some light on that, but the solution tendered has been to really engage these low moderate income communities, representatives from the communities and from disadvantaged communities in conversations around where to site charging. I will also say that I had a really interesting conversation last summer with a guy from Fresno State University, which who runs a program to help people with very old cars that no longer can pass California smog standards, and for that reason typically are not registered, but are still driven as, you know, basic transportation by low-income people. They have a program, they operate a program with funding from, I think, the state and the automakers, where they help those people, you know, either get a you know, used EV, which you know, a second or third hand Nissan Leaf, which may not have a lot of range, but has the range they need to do their daily driving, or sometimes also just repair the emission controls in those cars. They tend to controls tend to wear out after like 10 or 15 years. But anyway, the thing that was interesting that he said is that in his experience, it was not necessary to build charging fast chargers in low-income neighborhoods because people were very inventive about finding solutions to, you know, run extension cords outside of, you know, through windows and things like that. I mean, there may be safety concerns that I don't want to diminish in any way. But anyway, he said, like, that is not where, like, you know, his view is like, that is not where the state should be putting its money. The state should be putting its money into helping people get those cars in the first place. So that's an alternative perspective. That's not Nancy Ryan speaking, just relating an anecdote from my experience. Okay, so
Hey, Nancy,
moving on.
your video just went off, and also
I know. Sorry, I turned it off for a sec, but I'm back.
Okay, the way I read
Okay.
the question actually was a little different. It was,
Oh,
do you think that there's a risk of gentrification of a neighborhood, a low-income neighborhood, or an area with a lot of rentals, because the utility or third-party provider has put in charging?
no, I answered that question first, you know, and the answer was, you know, yeah, I mean, this is a concern. And it has been brought up. I've heard it come up many times. And the solution that the solution tendered by the California Commission, you know, has been to set up, you know, basically engage these communities where, you know, they, you know, intent is to put the charging, and, you know, so that, you know, they can help think through ways that it would, like, not necessarily, you know, like, so that concern about gentrification gets incorporated into the discussions.
I also,
But yeah,
if you can address the other question, or it was a statement somebody made that, you know, the ability to repair, and that makes me think, it would be just helpful to tell folks how much could a handy person repair on an electric vehicle? And, you know, there are a few parts that maybe go bad on an electric vehicle.
yeah, I have to say I am so unhandy. I don't even have an answer to that question. But you know, I don't know that it's as easy to take apart and repair a motor as it is to take apart and repair an engine. But I will just say that there are, you know, way fewer moving parts, I think, by an order of magnitude, and, you know, fewer things that can go wrong with them. You know, there's no transmission and so on. So that's part of the lifetime savings, is the expectation that there will be lower repair costs. But as to whether people can actually repair their own, handy people can repair their own car, I don't know. Let's see, I don't know if anybody's dropped anything in the chat. No. Okay. And you know, as far as, like, again, the things that are driving up the cost of new cars and the cost of insurance, like, you know, sensors and cameras, and, you know, and everything from bumpers to rear view mirrors, you know, that's really pretty much the same across EVs and conventional vehicles. There may be a little bit more technology stuffed into EVs to make them sexier, which might be part of why they cost more. Anyway, that is, I think, the biggest driver for why new cars cost so much, you know, have gone up faster. Okay, but moving on, Miles, next slide, please. Okay, so vehicle integration, I'll give you a definition in a sec, but first of all, just when you think about, like, EVs and the grid, there's multiple ways that, you know, particularly as EV adoption grows and we pass some of these tipping points, multiple ways that EVs interact with the grid. and just breaking the grid down from the bulk system all the way down to the premise level. In the bulk system, you may have, big charging plazas, and my next slide will show you just how big they can be, interconnecting directly to the transmission grid. If you get enough adoption, and we're not effective at exploiting the flexibility in EV charging loads, there could be, needs for new generation, or the needs that are being driven by things like hyperscaling data centers, could put EVs on the margin, even if they're not the biggest driver. So, you can't lose sight of that. And it's a factor that should be included in, it's a question that at least should be asked in, bulk power system planning. At the distribution level, both at the, A-bank substations where we step down from transmission to the distribution grid, and then, further out on the distribution grid, particularly if there's clustering, either at, individual, homes, or, a bunch of big depots together, and they often are together, then specific substations can be overloaded. It's good to anticipate that, particularly in more dense areas where the process to permit and build a substation can take a long time. In California, again, California is an outlier, I think, but it can take 10 years to, from the moment, the utility knows they need a new substation to when it's operating. It's not true in most places, but the lead time, again, if you think about how fast the cycle can be, particularly for medium and heavy duty, the lead time to get a substation deployed, at a minimum rivals, some of the, the turnarounds when we get into that hockey stick phase. Further out on the grid, the distribution circuits, again, it's a matter of clustering, EV adoption by, for personal use by residential customers is largely invisible to the utility. The process that leads up to it, at least, is invisible until it happens. Say more about that. And then, at the premise level, some people mentioned their panel, can't handle an EV, or it can't handle an EV in a and a heat pump. So, or we may see, overloading of distribution transformers. Let's see, Solange. Hello again, Solange. She was at our training last week from the Virgin Islands. So I think, Solange, I think what you're saying, if you want to chime in the chat and correct me, but I think you're saying it's not just the cosmetic or mechanical things that are being incorporated into cars. Actually, I'm not quite sure what you're saying. Why don't you elaborate on that? And I'll come back to your comment. I don't want to speculate if I have it wrong. So just add a little more. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about scale. This is a diagram from a great report that National Grid, RMI, and I think a few other organizations worked on together, that was basically, in all honesty, put together to make the case for a bill that National Grid ran unsuccessfully in New York, to kind of get authorization to pre-build upgrades to their transmission grid to support deployment of big charging plazas, either, exclusively for passenger vehicles, or, combination of vehicles and trucks. In New York, as in many places, the transmission lines run along the interstates, and so that's what they were looking at. And what I think is interesting here is their projections of how big, and this is not the total load, but how big the individual load at one of these facilities could be, looking out over time. So that's what these lines are, is, just how much power can an individual, large passenger / truck stop draw, as EV adoption grows over time, and these facilities get, have progressively more chargers and more powerful chargers to, so that they can serve higher and higher volumes of cars by moving them through, cars and trucks by moving through faster and faster. And you can see that they project that, like, by 2030, like, a large passenger and truck stop could draw as much as a small town, 20 megawatts. And, already, sorry, did I say by 2035? And already, in the next few years, again, the infrastructure that is getting planned and built now, can be, as big or bigger than a stadium. And again, the thing I want to stress is it takes a long time to, build, permit and build and go through all the wrangling to build a stadium. And towns don't just, spring up. But the charging load, can really come fast. Okay, yeah, I think what Solange and John and you're going back and forth about is that a lot of also what's happening with EVs is that their capabilities are being improved or tweaked through software upgrades, and I think sometimes those are just pushed down, but you probably have to have some agreement. Anyway, I'll let you all read the chat if this is a topic that's of interest to you. Okay, keep going. Next slide. Okay, so vehicle grid integration, this is a term of art. Here's one definition I took from a recent DOE report. So I'll let you read that definition for yourself. I'll take a drink of water. And as a practical matter, achieving cost-effective vehicle grid integration that doesn't impair the grid's reliability and, ideally makes it more reliable and resilient, involves a variety of strategies, both new forecasting methods, planning approaches and tools that use new kinds of data, but also building flexibility into utility practices, into the data they can bring to rate cases, into how they can, be more nimble about reacting to the arrival of these loads on the grid and reallocating capital budgets to go where the demands are going to be greatest. And then on the other side, and this is also largely a matter of policy, actually activating the latent flexibility in charging behavior, principally, though not exclusively, from personal vehicles via EV rates and managed charging programs. And I'll introduce this topic and then Andy will follow through with it. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about light duty vehicles and then medium and heavy duty vehicles, because again, the differences that I emphasized before between light duty vehicles and used as personal transportation versus principally medium and heavy duty vehicles in commercial applications at fleets of varying sizes, those translate into really different imperatives and different approaches for planning and actually serving these loads. So, for a light duty vehicle, it can double the draw of a typical house, particularly where I live in coastal California, where most people don't have air conditioning. It's even a bigger impact on, what is often a pretty old system. So, again, if you get clustering on the residential grid, lately, early, mainly in, more affluent areas, can very quickly start to overload distribution equipment out of the tendrils of the grid. As I said before, personal vehicles, largely invisible to the utility, efforts to get automakers to inform utilities about who was buying their cars like that did not fly. And there are a lot of things that we know, but a lot more that we don't know, particularly as, light duty adoption tracks up more and we get beyond the kind of technology enthusiast early adopters. So, we don't know exactly how fast, EVs will be adopted. Will the current headwinds, kind of flatten out the curve for a while, or what? We don't know. Charging behavior, there have been oodles of pilots to test all kinds of rates and managed charging programs, and we've learned a lot from them. But, how much will that carry over when the market, gets, moves beyond that initial nucleus? Will people continue to be largely satisfied with, meet most of their needs by charging at home at relatively slow paces? And then the question we've already talked about, how do we serve drivers who can't charge at home? Different solutions for that have different implications for the grid. It's probably, though not totally, like a less flexible load. If you think of a lot of lower income, like a lot of people who drive Lyfts and Ubers are lower income, and the cars come home at night, so they could charge overnight in the community or catch a fast charge when they come home, late at night when the grid is unstressed. RMI did a great study with EVgo on this a while ago. So, a lot of things to pay attention to. Then I'll come back and talk about V2X, which is shorthand for vehicle to everything, which encompasses a variety of bidirectional use cases. But, we don't really know how much, how many people are really going to want to let somebody else dispatch their battery, what the implications are for battery warranties, whether utilities really want these, flows on their grid. There's a lot of enthusiasm about bidirectional, but, its impact is really not known yet. So another thing to pay attention to. Next slide, please. Okay, so medium and heavy duty, again, different story. If you've seen one fleet, you've seen one fleet. What are the things that drive the impact of an individual fleet on the grid? How big is the fleet? How fast are the vehicles in that fleet turning over and electrifying? What kinds of vehicles are they? Are they trucks or buses or vans? What do they do all day and maybe all night? What are their duty cycles like? There's something called, like, what do they call it? Like vehicles that basically are like run all the time, like some of the drayage vehicles. The ports are, mostly 24/7, the big container ports. They do slip seating, as they call it, where, like, when one driver's shift is over, another driver gets in, the vehicle keeps going. Other vehicles like school buses and, transit buses, spend the night at the depot. So every fleet is a different story. When you aggregate them up in certain places, it might be different. And we'll come back to that. Also important, while personal vehicles sit around and are not used, are parked, most personal vehicles, light duty vehicles, are parked and not running for most hours of the day, and potentially, can provide, grid services that enable, load to be shifted around to meet whatever grid need you're trying to fulfill. That's not true for most, medium and heavy duty vehicles. And if they do sit around parked some of the time, that's dictated by their vocation, and maybe also rules about how many hours drivers can drive, or, union regulations or so on. So way less flexibility in general, and, unique to the composition and vocation of an individual fleet. I've said before, fleet vehicles are expensive, capital, they are capital equipment, just like machines at a factory. They aren't earning money for their owners unless the wheels are turning, hauling freight or whatever else they move. So for example, driving 10 miles off the interstate to go to a DC fast charging plaza that was located where it was cost effective for the utility isn't going to be cost effective for the fleet owner. We have to think about what that balance is, to think about whether or not an investment like that will actually be used and useful. Telematics, that's all the intelligence in the vehicle. As I said before, modern vehicles, and this is especially true for trucks and other medium and heavy duty vehicles, they are stuffed with sensors and intelligence, which send information, particularly for trucks, back, like in a practically continuous stream, back to servers where that data is intensively interrogated and used by sophisticated logistics, systems to optimize fleet operations. That's very valuable data. I'll have more to say about that. I would say, telematics data is also valuable for light duty vehicles, but it's really important for medium and heavy duty vehicles, and is a commercial. Anyway, I'll say more about this later. Don't assume that a truck depot, like that, if a fleet electrifies, they will just stick enough chargers for all their trucks at their depot, and that's what's going to happen. There are all kinds of new companies springing up that have different business models. Trucks as a service, charging as a service, charging infrastructure as a service. You can, rent, sort of effectively like rent out a charger at one of these commercial charging hubs, the same way you would like rent like a desk at a WeWork or something like that. And some fleets, want to electrify, but don't want to mess around with all the aspects of, owning, operating, choosing, servicing EVs. So they will actually effectively lease a truck. A lot of trucks are leased anyway. But anyway, so there's a variety of business models. And also, if designing programs for medium and heavy duty, you cannot assume that one size fits all. I'll have more to say about various on-site DERs. And then I'll note that in general, in the medium and heavy duty world, with some very important exceptions that I'll speak to, there is not a big interest in vehicle to grid. It's more like that's the reaction. Like, don't make me think about that. I've got a fleet to run. I got parcels to deliver. So more to come on that topic because that's not true for everyone. Next slide, please. Okay, so, I talked about some things that we know and a lot of things that we don't know with respect to vehicles that, really, complicate and I think to some extent complexify planning and, grid planning, particularly in the present time for the, distribution and to some extent the transmission grid. This comes at a time when, really, I think most utilities and regulators are, somewhat complacent, if not caught flat-footed by 3 decades of flat load growth and, which has led to a just-in-time planning, approach to planning and financing grid approaches, general conservatism, a lot of emphasis in the last 10 years on like, can we avoid grid upgrades, altogether by targeted deployment of DERs? So, they've got to execute a big pivot at a time when it's not just the TE loads, but the data centers and, onshoring manufacturing and, advanced manufacturing with all the robotics and computing is, much, much more energy intensive than the old assembly line. This is all leading to a recognition that there needs to be a more proactive approach to investment in the grid. There's a lot of talk about, oh no, but we could wind up with stranded costs. What if we build a new substation, in this area, thinking that there's going to be a lot of hubs and it doesn't happen, the cost could be stranded. These are legitimate concerns. This is part of what public utility commissions exist to do, is to, develop and implement, risk assessment frameworks. And they have after the fact ability to disallow costs if they, determine that, like the decision to incur that cost was not prudent. But what I want to stress here is that, there's a the risk is bilateral. There's also a risk of unserved load if upgrades are not improved in time. Again, if you've got, I have been to the Daimler truck plant outside of Portland, Oregon, and stood around the trucks that were E-Cascadia Class 8 tractors that were sitting in the parking lot, waiting to be shipped to a fleet in California, which was in turn waiting for Southern California Edison to upgrade the grid. So, and that's a loss, to a company. So again, from a macro perspective, not getting the charging, not upgrading the grid in time to support charging, that is also a risk that imposes real costs on the businesses who are the utilities customers. Or, if the, fleet is determined that the total cost of ownership of electrified trucks is lower than existing trucks, if they have to wait, there's a real cost too. Regulators, they're referees. They have to decide who pays. They try to, align the incidence of costs with, who gets the benefits. And there are a lot of assertions. When I was at Energy and Environmental Economics, we did oodles of studies along with MJ Bradley and ICF on trying to understand how, if EV adoption would indeed lower the average cost of service by spreading, spreading fixed costs over more kWh sales. That's, generally expected to be the case, at least over time, with grid upgrades to support charging. It may not be true for an individual facility in the short run as the, before the use of it really scales up. So these are all factors that commissions have to think about. And it's tough for them because right now, a lot of them are under the gun because rates have been going up. There's a lot of other inflationary pressures or genuinely inflationary pressures operating on utilities, independent of the investments that are needed to serve new load, which is, not the same as inflation. That's just growth. That's load growth. Okay. And so the real challenge is, how do we, how do we finance it? And then how do we do it in a way that it actually lowers the average cost of service or at least puts downward pressure on rates? Next slide, please. Okay, so there's some tools. And yeah, if you attend the distribution planning workshop that Lisa talked about at the beginning, there were some great presentations on some of the new tools. In particular, sort of trying to see, do bottoms up forecasting, and top down forecasting of EV charging load, and, seeing if you can kind of get them to more or less coincide. You can't just extrapolate from historic load, because these elements, electrified fleets were not, and personal vehicles were not part of historic load. So the standard econometric models will not work. They have to have something else incorporated, welded onto them, or in order to get something credible. So you can work upward from EV adoption projections, from input that comes from customers, big customers that operate fleets, smaller customers that operate fleets who might become big customers. That's important. Not every customer that will be a key account is a key account today. And then also say, well, what are the regulatory requirements that will apply in my state? What kind of charging loads do they translate into? What kind of load on the grid does that translate into? And there's some great tools from the labs and RMI to help do that. With those forecasts, augmented, more sophisticated forecasts in hand, it's time to move to new planning approaches to, try to anticipate where some of these needs are going to be. And I think that we can identify no regrets areas. Also recognize that, we might not get the forecast right. As somebody I was just listening to said the other day, all forecasts are wrong. So given that the forecast is going to be wrong, can we do something cheap today to buy some insurance that we have the means to adjust if the forecast was wrong? So maybe you build a larger vault for the transformer, or put the conduit in. So, if you undersized the facility, whatever distribution infrastructure you put out to a charging hub, if you undersized it, you don't have to go back and jackhammer up all the concrete again. It's a lot easier to, drop in some more capacity. Things like that, and if you were wrong, you haven't spent that much money. So, basically buying an option. There was also a great presentation or great discussion on scenario planning. I think it's a particularly great tool to identify, sort of least regret areas or investments to support electrification. Next slide, please. Tools and data. I'll talk a little bit about each one. So hosting capacity maps, the more granular and the more frequently updated these are, the more useful they are as a tool for fleets, and particularly for like the charging as a service, trucks as a service kind of companies that don't already have a depot, but are looking to locate facilities where they can get power and where there's need. They have some flexibility, or, people who are trying to, companies that are trying to build hubs along interstates, if they understand where there's spare capacity in the grid, if it, also supports their business model, they may go there. So hosting capacity, really valuable. I think that somebody just put out a new report on hosting capacity. Might have been mapping. I think it might have been Atlas Public Policy. More granular models for distribution planning. The one I'm familiar with, LoadSeer, is a highly, and it's not the only one, it's just the one I've seen, highly granular distribution system planning tool, on which I know Hawaiian Electric overlaid very localized projections of EV adoption on that to try to understand what they needed to do, again, kind of out on the tendrils of their grid. And then I'll talk a little bit about telematics data from vehicles and the EPRI EVs to Scale tool. Next slide, please. All right, I think I pretty much covered hosting capacity maps. There's an example of one from New York. So let's go on to the next slide. All right, so I mentioned telematics before. Again, cars and both personal, vehicles that are intended for personal use, and light, medium, and heavy duty vehicles operated by fleets have telematics systems. A combination of sensors and intelligence on the vehicle. If you've, ever taken your car to the shop and they plug the, the thing into it, to interrogate the onboard diagnostics system, the OBD, or EVs have battery management systems, that can be interrogated probably via the OBD port. All that kind of information is, the car is constantly, sensing and thinking and at varying rates, conveying that information back to the server, as illustrated in the diagram at the top. And in the case of fleets, that information is used. It's very valuable information that is commercialized in a variety of ways. The diagram at the bottom gives examples of what kinds of benefits a fleet can realize by, really taking advantage of that information. And it's things like, is the driver driving safely? Does the truck need some sort of repair? Are the tires low? Is the vehicle adequately utilized? Where's it going? Is it taking the most efficient route? Where does it stop, start, and dwell? All of that stuff is in telematics data, and obviously there's mountains and mountains and mountains of it, and it is a valuable and underutilized resource for grid planning, but there are some steps towards changing that. So that's the EPRI's EVs to Scale project. So I'll talk about that in a minute, but I want to give an example of how useful this information can be. So next slide, please. So here is an aerial photograph taken in the vicinity of the Ontario Airport in Southern California. So Ontario is kind of to the east of Los Angeles. You can see it's circled in yellow, the airport circled in yellow. And all those white roofs around the airport, those are all warehouses where trucks come and go and, drop off and, and pick up goods and then, head off on the interstates, which are the green and the red lines. And so, Southern California Edison, of course, has a map that they could superimpose on this of what their grid assets are in that area now, and probably their age and condition and loading and so on, all the information that would be in a hosting capacity map. And if you take the telematics data that fleet operators or the manufacturer who made their trucks have access to, then you can see what the loading in places like this, very concentrated load setters will be as the fleets that use those warehouses become, progressively more electrified. Next slide, please. So this is based just on data that Daimler Trucks North America, which has about a 40% share of the Class 8 trucks, so again, the tractors, which again are the ones that drive all the miles and will also use the most electricity. And those dots represent kind of what the potential demand would be for each of those warehouses, or it might be like for some little granular unit of area. But anyway, how much nameplate capacity would go into this area? And if those trucks were all electrified, by I'm not sure what their time frame is, but anyway, in some time frame. And the point that I want to make here is we don't know which of these warehouses will electrify first in which order, although we might, if we knew more about the fleets that use them, we might be able to make an educated guess. But we do have a really pretty reasonable way to guess what the overall load in that area is. Again, that's subject to whatever assumption is realistic about potential to manage or spread out that load with the right incentives. But this is the kind of information that a company like a utility like Southern California Edison could use to say, okay, well, this is what we're going to need a new substation in this area, in 5 to 10 years or 8 to 12 years or whatever, and then we can monitor, how that load progresses over time and zero in, on what we need, and maybe take some initial steps today, like acquiring the land, or ordering a big, some of the big custom switchgear and transformers. Knowing that, some of those investments are, they're not stranded. So I think we're in better shape than people sometimes think. So anyway, I think this is very valuable data that we haven't really figured out. I mean, this is just kind of an example, an illustrative example. We haven't really in a systematic way figured out how to make full use of this data and really fully build it into forecasting and planning and and ultimately rate cases. But I think it's really promising. And let's see, Miles, next slide, please. And EPRI has been working with the big truck OEMs and I think also lots of other fleet operators to try to gather and aggregate as much of that data as possible to paint the most granular and complete picture that it can of what energy consumption, and now I think they're starting to come out with loads, will be at a pretty tight, I think it's, what do they call them? Hex 8. I'm not sure what that is. Maybe 8. I'm not going to, anyway, at a pretty granular level. So that utilities can really start to understand, utilities across the country can really start to understand what loads, sorry about that, what loads might show up in their service territory. And this is a great tool. They've got it on the web. I'm sure they would be happy to brief you. And we're sort of just beginning to see how this can be incorporated into utility planning. Next slide. And I'll give an example later on about how that's happening. Okay, so that's the planning side, planning and forecasting. The other piece of this is managing load, and whether by sort of active management, which refers to a third party, the utility, an OEM, an aggregator, managing charging of a car to optimize it relative to the distribution grid or the bulk power system. There's various things that might be your objective, or designing rates that provide an incentive for customers to shift their charging themselves, using timers in vehicles or apps and so on. So this is really the principal tool you have sort of once the load is there. But again, I think it's really important to think about what do we want to do? Because when the load, starts to show up faster, it would really be wise to have already sort of established some norms and practices and know what you want to scale up, or what you want to have as a mass market offering, as demand, scales up, and not try to create those expectations after the fact once the adoption's occurred. Next slide. So there's a definition of managed charging. I think I discussed this enough that I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time, and go to the next slide. And I just want to note that there have been a lot of pilots. Andy's going to talk about some. Lots of pilots for managed charging, lots of pilots for TOU rates. We really don't need to reinvent the wheel. One of the most valuable things that people in your shoes can do is to say wait, they already tried that in North Dakota. And do we really need to do another pilot in South Dakota of the exact same thing or just a minor tweak to it? Or can we use that as the baseline and really significantly improve on it? And also, it's really important that these pilots get designed so that there's a pathway to a cost-effective mass market program is understood. Pilots are expensive. Pilots don't pass cost-benefit tests as a general rule because they have high administrative costs. But they should ask questions like, how much does the incentive really need to be, and what kind of response do we get, from different levels of incentives? Ask the questions that really inform the scale up to mass market. There's, I'll just note in passing that there's kind of a big struggle underway about who can access driver's data. I'm talking now about the light duty vehicles, the telematics for light duty vehicles. They're full of information about how people drive, when they charge. They're companies that, aggregators that with the customer's permission use that data to anticipate their driving needs and therefore manage their charging on their behalf. But there's a kind of a titanic struggle between the utilities, the OEMs, and the third-party aggregators for who gets access to that data on what terms at what cost, because they appreciate that it's valuable. And I think this has been a bit of a barrier to commercializing some of these managed charging programs. And to the extent that commissioners have an opportunity, regulatory commissions have an opportunity to referee this, I think that could be beneficial. Okay, and it is an issue. Just be aware of that. Next slide, please. Okay, again, managed charging for medium and heavy duty vehicles. I've hammered on, it's all about the vocation. It's all about cost. You cannot carry over assumptions about light duty vehicles to medium duty vehicles. That said, they are sensitive to cost. The cost of the electricity to charge the vehicles is a big factor in their, TCO equation and in their ongoing, planning for operations. And to the extent that they see tariffs that are aligned, with the utilities cost, genuine, cost-based pricing, fleets that have flexibility, will, I think, can be expected to adapt operations in ways that, again, minimize their costs and maximize their profits. And, that may, result in some shift in alignment with grid needs. But, this is not something that, and then there are certain fleets, again, that charge, that are going to charge overnight at the depot. They probably don't need an incentive to do that. And if there's TOU pricing where it's cheap at night, great. But, do not expect to be able to, shift the vast majority of these loads, significantly. So other thing, flexibility often is more about hardware, like, and I'll give you some concrete examples in a sec, but it's often about hardware or certain types of software solutions that are, really different than what you see for light duty vehicles. So flexibility, flexibility can mean something different, and I'll give you examples of that in this context. Next slide. Okay, so just again some terminology. V2G really means something, vehicle to grid. V1G doesn't really, translate into words, but basically just corresponds, is used as shorthand for any kind of modulation or control of the rate at which the vehicle takes power from the grid to charge. Whereas V2G refers to a vehicle with bilateral capability, both charging and discharging to the grid. Kind of stepping stones to V2G that are less complex from the utilities point of view would be like vehicle to house or vehicle to building or vehicle to load. I think I have another graphic on the next slide. Let's go to that. So anyway, that's the kind of the terminology for these various actual relations, direct relations between the vehicle and the grid. V to X, so again, generically, anything that involves discharging from the vehicle's battery. Again, that can be vehicle to grid, vehicle to the house, or it could be just vehicle to load. You're a gardener or you go camping and you plugged, something into the outlet on the vehicle, or you charge your electric drill or your battery lantern for camping, whatever. So, there's a variety of use cases that can take advantage of bidirectional capability. There have been lots of tests, like pilots and really mainly smaller demos to, demonstrate, the technical feasibility of doing this, to evaluate things like the impact on the battery, to, figure out what standards and other things are needed to make it work. At the LA Air Force Base, there was a big demo several years ago with non-tactical vehicles. So, vehicles that ran around, the base doing things that didn't have to do with actually fighting a war. PG&E and Ford have a demo in California where vehicles discharge to the house, like in times when PG&E has to shut off the neighborhood, shut off the power to the neighborhood, the high fire risk areas. There have been studies like by my former colleagues at E3 and elsewhere that have demonstrated that because they can have multiple charge and discharge sessions, or sorry, multiple cycles of charging and discharging during a single charging session, bidirectionally equipped vehicles can provide, significantly more and in some instances more valuable grid services than just managing the rate and timing of charging with a, conventional V1G charge. There are still a lot of questions. We really don't know, what the uptake will be, how many people will want this, and how many utilities will accept it. There has been a lot of work, and work is ongoing on developing the product standards, the interconnection rules. You need export tariffs. No one's going to do it, and OEMs aren't going to put it in the vehicle unless you get paid for providing services. So some great resources cited at the bottom of the slide. Next slide. Okay, so my last sort of few minutes, I'll just slow down a little bit and walk you through a few interesting use cases. So I mentioned that, most fleets, don't want anything to do with V2G, at least today. And, they're like, it's enough already. Electrifying is hard enough for us. But the one that is really hot and of great interest is school buses, because they have a consistent, dedicated vocation, and very regular, both daily and seasonal schedules. And there are a lot of them in the country. And many of the kids who ride on today's diesel school buses are from, lower income communities where they often already have disproportionate exposure to harmful air pollutants. And consequently, there's been quite a bit of funding, I think, under the Bipartisan Act for the EPA to run a clean school bus program rebates. And we are seeing not only a lot of replacement of school buses with electric school buses, but some, as you can see on the map in the bottom right-hand corner, lots of pilots and demos all around the country, and probably a good 20 states. And pictured in the top right and described in the bottom left are Oakland, California. So that's where I live. And Oakland converted its entire school bus fleet to e-buses. And they, take the kids to school in the morning, and then they go back to the depot and they charge on solar power all day long. And then they go off and they fetch the kids and take them home, and then they come back, in the late afternoon, right as the solar generation is tailing off. And normally California would be firing up peaker plants, and they can discharge to the grid because they typically come back from, driving kids around with the battery not entirely depleted. They can discharge, knowing that they'll be charging all night. So really great, very valuable grid services. And we, again, lots of pilots and examples. So very cool. And, some other fleets that have very regular duty cycles, could also be candidates for this. Next slide. Then I also talked about, for medium and heavy duty vehicles, principally the charging plazas. Well, the charging plazas that serve medium and heavy duty vehicles, but also provide like the Tesla supercharger station in the bottom right corner, pictured in the bottom right corner, that lots and lots of high powered charging, serving lots and lots of cars and I guess cyber trucks, are often we see, they don't have a lot of flexibility. This is a convenience product. If they're trucks, they got to get back on the road right away. If it's a person, there's only so long you can spend drinking a latte and before you get impatient and want to get back in your car and go. So these have to, the trend in across all vehicle classes is to try to make the charging experience faster and faster and provide, on-site amenities commensurate with the amount of time that people have to spend there. And in instances where grid capacity is scarce, either the utility can't provide all they need right away, or it's prohibitively expensive to do that, you do see DERs being deployed at the site. So the top left corner is I don't know if it's the exact one, but it's a rendering of a charge plaza for trucks that like Green Lane, which is a NextEra, Daimler, BlackRock JV to build corridor charging all along interstates in Southern California and, reaching into Arizona and Nevada. So they will, integrate canopies over the charge stations. You can also see that there's a solar array next to it. So if it's, along the interstate out in the desert, it's, realistic to, generate a fair amount of power. And then the white boxes, I'm assuming several of them are batteries, and you see batteries deployed a lot. Batteries, depending on how they're packaged, they can be picked up and moved. So like if, Southern California Edison, gets all the power out there that they need, Green Lane may pick those batteries up and take them to their next site while they're waiting for the power. And these sites are huge. There's a couple of links to articles underneath the picture of the Tesla supercharger station. I'll note, like Tesla announced a few months ago, they're building a supercharger station in Florida that's going to have 200 stalls. It's halfway between Palm Beach and Disney World. So it's, again, not just California. These, big, super high power charging stations going in all over the place. And yeah, so some of these DERs can be either permanent or temporary parts of their integration onto the grid, literally, physically. Next slide. I just talked about self-generation using solar. It's also the case, and depending on whether your state, depending on the air quality and CO2 objectives in your state, this may or may not be seen as a good outcome. But this is an example built near one of the ports down in California. Again, I think to serve drayage vehicles. You can see all the tractors plugged in. So Dinker, which was built by Prologis, and for Maersk, which is a big container operator, they put linear generators on site. I think that's what that box is, right next to the light pole in the foreground. So linear generators that can run on renewable natural gas or hydrogen or conventional natural gas. They can also make hydrogen. So again, if the utility can get the power there, like eventually, then they can take. This was actually in Los Angeles Department of Water and Power service territory, and they just said, forget it, we can't do it. But if they can get the power there eventually, then those linear generators can pick up and go someplace else. But again, that's another kind of solution, is to self-generate. Next slide, and also my last slide. So what about utilities, again, doing proactive investments like I talked about before, looking ahead beyond the capital budget that's covered in the upcoming rate case. California has a 4-year cycle of 3-year rate cases, 1 test year and 2 attrition years. But what if it takes 8 to 10 years to build a substation? You got to anticipate that and start to plan for it in the 3-year pendency of the rate case. So Southern California Edison, use data like telematics data and the EPRI EVs to scale and surveys of fleet operators to try to project loads in their service territory, like the example that I showed you, and put that in their rate case. Also, utility assets like mobile substations or mobile batteries that, again, could be picked up and moved from project to project to provide, partial energization for customers. So they have asked for a boatload of money. I'm sorry, I don't know the amount. I think it's at least $1 billion in the rate case they're currently pending rate case. There should be a decision in this case in the first quarter of 2025. I think this is a really important test case that will, get into, that will demonstrate whether the California Commission, is willing to rely on some of these new planning tools and embrace proactive planning to support, the very ambitious goals that the Air Resources Board, at the direction of the legislature and governor, have put in place. So, I'm waiting to see if everybody rose together on this. So, I kind of stay tuned for this. This will make, when this decision comes out, it'll make a big splash one way or the other. Sorry. Let's see, next slide. I'll just note that, let's see, those are resources. If you want to know more about EVs, NARUC has EV website and a state EV working group with presentations once a month. Next slide. There's a cost benefit analysis, a guide to how to do cost benefit analysis for managed charging in the works. The Berkeley lab will be getting out soon. Next slide. And here is a whole bunch of resources. Some of these are things that are cited on the slides, and but there are many things cited on the slides that are not in this list. So consider this a supplemental list. And with that, I will thank you for your attention and turn the floor over to Andy.
Thanks, Nancy. Are you going to stick around? Because we might have.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, am I
Okay.
supposed to do Q&A now? Or you want to do it at the end?
For that right now. So we're going to go to Andy, and then
Okay.
if you have questions for Andy.
Okay.
You might have some opinions as well.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Nancy. That was excellent as always. Appreciate the setup there. So let me just share my slides here. So I'm going to be kind of providing some background and introductory material related to electric vehicle rate design. This is primarily just kind of as a launching point from what Nancy was talking about. Again, this is really primarily geared towards light duty vehicles and multi family charging and public charging stations. In part because, as Nancy mentioned, medium and heavy duty vehicles especially are very vocation kind of specific. And so electric vehicle rate design tends to be focused a little bit more on the light duty vehicle and public charging space where customer behavior and customer response is really important to guide charging decisions and EV deployment questions. So my colleague Pete Kappers presented some, I think, cost of service regulation background material to you. So I'm going to literally pull in his slides, a couple of them here, and just kind of reset and reorient you to the basics around rate making, why it's so important, especially for those of you working with regulators, and then how it sort of relates to the rate design questions that we'll go through around electric vehicles. So just as a launching off point, and as a reminder, it's in this space, in the retail electricity markets, it's state regulators and not the markets themselves that set electricity prices with an objective of being consistent with, or trying to, in some cases, ensure competitive outcomes from these monopoly firms. For states that are vertically integrated, that means utilities that own generation, transmission, and distribution assets. That's retail rates for energy and delivery. And then in restructured states or deregulated states, it's just the retail rates for delivery that are set by the regulators. Importantly, and really critically, these are cost-based rates. And so regulators really approve rates that reflect the cost of service that's delivered by the utility. And how do they determine that? Well, there's a lot of ink that's been spilled by attorneys and other very bright individuals around questions of, are those costs prudently incurred? Are the assets that the utility is using, are they used and useful to provide this service? Are those rates fair and responsible? But importantly, the rates should be sufficient to recover the utility's costs. And for shareholder-owned, investor-owned utilities, that also includes an opportunity, not a guarantee, but an opportunity to earn a rate of return on those investments comparable to other entities that face similar risks. And so this cost-based environment, I think, is probably kind of best is an analogy of a pie, and especially here at the holiday time, should be one that we're all maybe thinking about, at least I am. So what are these costs, right? So you'll hear this term, that utilities revenue requirement, and think of this as the pie, right? And the annual revenue requirement for the utility is set equal to the costs to serve their retail customers in a year. So this is an annual revenue requirement that reflects annual utility costs. And these costs there's a pretty lengthy process around cost of service studies that identifies what these costs are and assigns them different categories, and they think of them as costs also like from an accounting basis. So what is the return on an asset or return of the asset, and depreciation, other types of expenses and capital costs. But importantly, there's a period of time, a test year revenue requirement that's used to design and set the level of retail electricity rates. And this typically happens in a general rate case. In most states, this is a historical value. So they look at a known and measurable period of costs in maybe the previous year or the year before that. Or a few states actually use a future projected value in which they go through an exercise to project their costs in some future time period. But this sets the size of the pie, so that this revenue requirement gives us the whole pie. And then that pie is divided up and allocated to each of the customer classes. And this determines how much of that pie, how much of those annual utility costs is each customer class responsible for. So now we know the total pie, and then we know each share of that pie among the groups of customer classes for that utility. And so that gives us the responsibility for each of these customer classes. And rate design itself then determines how each slice of that pie, each piece of that responsibility that the customer class has, is collected from the customers. So we allocate this revenue responsibility to each customer in each customer class. And ideally, in the end, your rate design should result in the entire slice of that pie being collected from those customers annually, no more and no less. So there's a very cost-based system that we operate in the retail electricity regulation markets. And so there's this cost-based element to it. And then on top of that, we layer, okay, well, what color that pie is, what flavor that pie is, what shape that pie is, can be all sorts of different things. And those are informed by objectives and considerations that regulators have. This is a commonly cited one, the Baum-Bright principles. This was published, I think, in the 1960s. And it goes through some commonly employed rate design principles. And these can include, ease of customer understanding, like simplicity of rates, ease of implementation of the rates, collecting the utility's cost of service, being fair in the way it apportions those costs among customers, avoiding, undue discrimination. And importantly, as Nancy had on that slide of I think the person trying to balance all these spinning plates, is it really balancing these is a bit more of an art than a science. It's really about the regulator prioritizing their policy goals and objectives and designing rates around those. And so you could think about, highly economically efficient price signals, that change the price of electricity in every single hour. Well, they may not be particularly easily implemented, or they may not be understood by customers in a way that makes sense. And so this is an important balance in a set of considerations that regulators face. And so with that, I think that's a jumping off point I wanted to get us to, so that we can talk about electric vehicle rates by starting with these state policy driven objectives that we often see serve as the basis for EV rate design. So we published a kind of an EV rate design 101 brief and went through and developed these 5 kind of state policy driven objectives. And I'll go through each one of these. And then from these, the actual design elements of these rates are closely connected. So the first one is a lot of states just have a policy goal around EV adoption. So particularly states that have zero emission vehicle goals, states that have transportation decarbonization goals. It's really about just getting people to adopt electric vehicles. And so the rate design considerations there are these rates that are easily understood relative to the way that customers engage with their gasoline bills? Are they rates that maybe make it easy and simple and convenient to charge their vehicle? So that's one objective, is EV adoption. Another EV rate design objective might just be grid management. And think of this as, how do you manage the current existing grid? So using electric vehicle charging in locations or at times that you know, deal with voltage issues or capacity issues on the distribution system, or kind of capacity and other system services at the transmission and bulk power system levels. Um, Somewhat related, but I think it's distinct in a few ways. There's also policy objectives around system economic efficiency, especially as we think about as the grid needs to evolve and build out in the future to meet this charging load. How do we ensure that that charging occurs in a way that minimizes the cost pressures? So a system economic efficiency objective might focus on marginal costs rather than average costs, and how to charge vehicles at times and locations that minimize those upward cost pressures. Decarbonization may be a state policy driven objective. So this, you could think about this as rates that send signals to customers to charge at times, when emissions are low on the grid, maybe middle of the day in California when we have a lot of, solar generation, for example. And then equity is also a state policy objective and a consideration around electric vehicle rate design. So how do you deploy rates that not only avoid discrimination for certain groups of customers, but ones that reflect the community's needs and fairly apportion benefits around comfort and safety and emissions and cost savings to customers in certain communities. So I'm going to now go through a series of kind of design elements and provide some examples. But as we go through these, we'll want to tie back to these state policy driven objectives to really think about how those influence the specific design choices. Before we get there, though, we're going to launch the first of several polls I have for you. This one I'm just kind of curious to know, just from your perspective, what do you think is the EV rate design objective that's the most important? Here, I'm going to limit you to a single choice, but I'm kind of curious which one for you, from your perspective, is the most important. This is interesting. Okay, it seems like the responses are slowing down here. A pretty a decent mix across. It seems like we share some in common, but we have at least one vote for all of them. Looks like grid management got the #1 vote, followed by decarbonization. So that's great. Thanks for sharing, and kind of keep those in mind as we talk about these rate design elements and how they might tie back to these objectives. So I've tried to break the EV rate design into 5 components. We'll go through each one of these individually and provide some examples. I think it's important to note not every electric vehicle rate has all of these components, but I think across the swath of EV rates that we see, they're designed using some combination of these 5 components. So the first one, and Nancy did a nice job teeing this one up. So the first kind of design element in question in EV rate design is how are you going to meter the EV charging and the EV load? So on one hand, you can do it just by adding it to the rest of the loads in the home. So this would be like a whole home or a whole facility consumption. And here you're just using the utility's existing account meter. If you want to submeter the electric vehicle charging and know how much that EV is charging separate from all the other consumption at that site, you can do it one of 2 ways. So one is you could install an additional utility account meter and submeter that EV charging consumption. Or you can use the electric vehicle supply equipment, here think of the charger, or the vehicle itself to submeter that consumption. Now, that is an area which is kind of emerging. California is the only state that I'm aware of that has that allows the vehicle charging equipment to actually record for revenue purposes and submeter the electric vehicle, the charging. This is where states really need to make a decision. There's a lot of rules around the revenue grade metering of electricity consumption, and generally the State Department of Agriculture, their weights and measures office, or sometimes the state PUC needs to determine that something is a revenue grade meter. And again, to date, I'm only aware of California saying that the electric vehicle chargers and vehicles qualify for that. So that's an important consideration. But why does this matter in general for EV rate design? Well, whether we meter or sub-meter has some important design decisions and implications. So Georgia Power has had a time of use rate. It's a whole home rate for many, many years. In this case, again, the rate applies to all the home electricity usage and demand. Importantly, it doesn't require an additional separate meter installation, and it doesn't require changes to the utilities, data collection, and billing systems. But it can be a disincentive to electric vehicle charging, especially if they have a tiered rate. Tiered rates are where you pay more per kilowatt hour as your consumption increases. So you can imagine if you add an electric vehicle to your home, your consumption goes up quite noticeably, and could push you into those higher tiers of charges. So it could be a disincentive to adopting an electric vehicle in that case. On the other hand, just one of many examples, Austin Energy offers a sub-metered electric vehicle rate. This applies only to the electric vehicle usage and demand. It does require a separate meter box and a dedicated circuit. Sometimes the utility pays for this, and in many cases, the customer will pay for this. And so those are additional costs either to the customer or to the utility that would have to be recovered from ratepayers. But the rate design, when it's sub-metered, may send a clearer cost-based price signal to the customer, and can really drive specific electric vehicle charging behavior in that case. The second element is temporal differentiation. So this is really, does the rate vary based on the time of day or the season of the year? So, seasonally, system profiles and system costs and system emissions look different. On an hourly basis, they look especially different. And you could think about like periods like peak and off-peak periods, which is used to define rates. And even within the hour, every 5 minutes or 15 minutes, those costs and loads will change as well. And so, the rate may vary based on those time period differentiations that you care about. And again, it could be based on changes in load across seasons or hours or within the hour. Also, system cost differences and emissions will change. I will note emissions, especially on the power grid, don't tend to change as much as loads and costs do. They don't tend to be quite as variable, especially on like a sub-hourly basis, but there is some differentiation on emissions that are important, especially if decarbonization is your policy objective. Locational differentiation, again, is a very similar kind of concept. The costs and loads and emissions on the system will vary depending on what part of the electricity system you're talking about. So at the bulk power system, generation and high voltage transmission towers that you see, at the distribution system, so individual feeders, or maybe at these substations that are somewhat larger aggregations, those costs and especially the loads will be different. And then site specific, right? An individual home loads and costs will differ, especially when you add electric vehicle charging to it. So I think one of the best kind of illustrations of both of these elements comes from the San Diego Gas and Electric tariff. This is their schedule VGI. It's still considered a pilot rate, and it has both a temporal and a locational element to it. So on the left is the temporal element. They add a cost that reflects the costs of the wholesale market during certain peak hours. So it's a critical peak price adder, and you can see it's added to the top 150 system peak hours from the California ISO wholesale market demand forecasts. On the right, there's a locational differentiation adder. So here they add a charge. It's actually quite significant. It's about a little bit less than $1 per kilowatt hour, so it's quite a lot. If you charge during the top 200 hours of that circuit, that's feeding the charging station. San Diego Gas and Electric has helped customers understand when to avoid these hours or when these charges would occur by putting together a map for customers. And this rate serves public charging stations or kind of multi-unit charging stations. And so customers have some ability to look at the map and say, you know, I'm not going to go to this specific location and charge. I can go down the road. I don't know how far it is in this case, but I can go down the road and maybe charge for less because this location over here doesn't have this distribution rate adder. But it's a good example of how you can differentiate both on a locational and a temporal basis. Demand charges. So in practice, larger loads, especially commercial and industrial loads, tend to face demand charges. These are intended to collect very specific demand-driven costs. You know, very peaky loads tend to drive requirements to build out the infrastructure to serve those loads, and they tend to be the ones that drive, you know, distribution and transmission investments in particular. And so the industry for a long time has used demand charges that vary based on a seasonal basis. They base on whether you are your peak matters or your peak relative to other customers matters, the period over which they measure that relative basis of your peak demand. But this could be a disincentive to electric vehicle charging, especially the DCFC, or direct current fast charging, which is very peaky load to charge vehicles over a shorter time frame. And so in order to sort of incentivize and encourage EV adoption, and especially the installation of these large high demand public charging or multifamily chargers, utilities are thinking about alternatives to these demand charges to not disincentivize that. I think one of the more interesting things that I've seen around this is these load factor based demand charges. And the objective here is kind of twofold. One is to recognize that at low utilization, so when you put in a public charging station, it's not necessarily the case that all of those chargers are going to be occupied from day one, you know, 24/7, right? That there's going to take some time, especially in locations that may not have high electric vehicle adoption. And so some of these rates, what they do is they try not to penalize these public chargers by either discounting the demand charge until their utilization increases. And especially the second element is to encourage charging to happen that's not coincident with the peak on that system. And so this example on the left is Pacific Power. It's in Oregon. They actually discount the energy charge if that energy, if that charging is occurring off peak, basically. So you pay less per each incremental kilowatt hour of charging, such that you're not driving the peak. On the right, National Grid has a demand charge alternative program based on their load factor calculation in the bottom of that graphic. You can see at the first year, they just give a straight holiday on the demand charge. And then after that, they will discount the demand charge based on sort of that load factor. So how much energy is being used to charge the vehicles, and then how much of that energy is occurring relative to the peak demand. And then last, again, this is a good one that Nancy set up. So, you know, charging controls is another possible design element for rates. So in some cases, there's just one-way communication from the utility to the electric vehicle, telling them to charge or not charge based on a price or a control signal. In some cases, there may be two-way communication between the vehicle and the charger to the utility system. And you know, really kind of comes down to a design decision around, does the utility have control of the charging, or does the customer have control of the charging? And those come with important, you know, considerations for customer satisfaction, reliability of the response of the vehicle, and the benefits that it can provide to the system. This is a pretty interesting example. This one got a lot of discussion at our Charlotte training. And so Green Mountain Power, they're a utility in Vermont. They offer two options for customer electric vehicle charging. One of them, you provide the utility control over your vehicle charger, and it's this one on the left here. It's rate 72. You allow the utility to disable the charging up to an average of 5 to 10 times per month for an average of 2 to 6 hours at a time. But you are given the opportunity and the ability to opt out of those controls, but you pay a pretty large rate as a result, and you can see it's about 81 cents a kilowatt hour. But for all of your other charging, doesn't matter when it's happening, if it's happening outside of these peak hours where the utility would otherwise want to control and shut off your charger, you just pay around 16 cents, 15.8 cents a kilowatt hour. On the right, the other option for customers that the utility offers is just a straight time of use peak to off peak rate. There is no utility control of the charger, but you're paying almost 20 cents a kilowatt hour if that's occurring between 1 and 9 p.m. On weekdays, and otherwise you're paying about 15.2 cents a kilowatt hour. It's interesting to see what customers sign up when they're given two options, right? So at least through 2023, they reported, the utility did, about a little less than 900 of their customers were enrolled in the opt-out rate 72 utility charging control rate, and about a little over 1,700 were enrolled in that straight time of use rate 74. Interestingly, the utility claims that in terms of opting out of those utility events, only 0.25% of their customers actually opted out during a peak event, which is an incredibly low opt-out rate. So before we get to the poll, I think might be a chat. Let me just make sure there's not a question here. Okay, so why don't we do another poll here? So this one is kind of a bit of a quiz. Actually, I'm just sort of interested to see your perspectives on this. So thinking back to our rate design objectives, if you were focused on just system economic efficiency, so mitigating, and lowering those future marginal costs, what design elements would you want to include? You can choose multiple ones here. So think through how you might design a rate if system economic efficiency was your objective. And there's really no wrong answer. Kind of curious. Okay, so this is very interesting. And if any of you have taken an economics course or are economists yourselves, obviously it depends is the classic response to this. And I clearly didn't give you enough information as to which costs you would be focused on. But I think this is interesting. I think it shows not only the fact that there are just a number of ways to design these rates and achieve some of these objectives, but that you all quickly picked up on the differentiation, not only of just the EV charging itself, but the fact that costs and loads and things change, especially on an hourly basis, but also kind of demand driven basis. And so, yeah, I think it's kind of interesting that kind of across the board, sort of all the elements showed up here. It's great. Thanks for doing that. So, just a couple more kind of comments about like in practice, EV rate design itself isn't the only way to achieve these objectives. There's other program incentives that can be added. This actually comes from a 2021 SEPA paper. That had a nice kind of survey to see that, a lot of utilities were combining incentives with the EV rate itself. So whether rebate for the charger, for the vehicle, enrollment and participation incentives. That Green Mountain Power example I gave you, they actually will they'll pay for your charger if you select from one of two options that they have. And so you can get like a free charger if you buy the one the utility will give you a rebate on. So it's important to also recognize that rates themselves are not the only thing to achieve these objectives. There's other program design considerations. In terms of what utilities are actually offering to customers, we did this survey. This was and looked at all the available EV rates as of through early 2023. So I'll link to the study here. We picked up about 130, a little over 130 of them, 136 specifically, EV retail rates. In terms of what is most offered, we really saw on the residential side, it's a lot of this sub-metered electric vehicle charging and just time of use energy rates, and really nothing around demand charges, locational differentiation or requirement around charging controls. Commercial customers, kind of the same, a lot more around, the sub-metered EV charging, again, time of use rates. And then, a lot of utilities were providing some sort of an alternative demand charge, typically just a holiday from the demand charge for some period of time at those for those kind of commercial rates. And then utility owned charging infrastructure rates were even more kind of simplistic. It's either a flat energy charge or a block charge. In some cases, they offered a time of use energy charge. So I think this is kind of a question for the industry around, like, how do we advance electric vehicle rates to have the elements that we've talked about in practice. They don't tend to have a lot of those pieces to them, which suggests maybe EV adoption by far is the kind of main policy objective, or sort of offering simplistic rates to customers, at least at this point, is the main objective. So with that, I am kind of curious from your all's perspective. It sounds like some of you actually own electric vehicles. So I am curious for you all, what are the most common EV rate designs that you have come across? Some of this is to kind of verify what we found in our survey, but just to also kind of see, from your all's perspective, how you engage with electric vehicle rates. And yeah, if you don't have enough experience to say, that's helpful to know as well. Yeah, and this based on the responses so far, they seem to kind of comport with what we found in our survey as well. And so, yeah, that's great. Thanks for answering that. So the flat fee one is interesting. I'll just comment on that briefly. There are several utilities that offer a flat rate. In fact, that Austin Energy rate I was mentioning has it's like at least the last time I checked, it was like $40 a month for all you could charge, sort of I think it was a buffet rate, but they would shut off the chargers during the utility's peak to avoid driving that a higher peak demand. And in some cases, that's very straightforward for customers, right? To know I'm on a flat fee, I'm going to pay this amount every month, it doesn't change, and it can help them sort of compare against their gasoline bill that they probably are more familiar with on a total amount basis as well. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to cover here was, do customers actually respond to these electric vehicle rate designs? I think to Nancy's point, there's been a lot of pilots, there's been a limited number of evaluations we can lean on. And so what are some things that we've kind of observed out there in the field? So this is based on a review of 11 evaluation reports that were published through 2020. In terms of evaluation reports that include the actual load impacts of electric vehicle charging and of rates, there's not a lot out there. In fact, there's really not been much since 2020. And so I think that's just an aside for folks working with commissions, to think about what are the reporting requirements that you would want the utility to have, and what kind of information is important for the regulators to have, sort of to answer their questions and address some of the uncertainty around electric vehicle rates. But anyways, so these pilots were pretty evenly split between whole home and sub-metered rates. They had fairly low 2-to-1 peak to off-peak ratios. A small numbers you can see here in this figure were above a 4-to-1 peak to off-peak ratio, which is a bit of a stronger price signal and incentive for customers to avoid charging on peak. So across these, what do we find? Well, first of all, not surprisingly, properly designed rates can be a pretty effective tool for managing EV charging behavior. This report on the left here, this figure comes from a Detroit Energy study. You can see that customers really avoided charging during the coincident peak period from 3 to 7 p.m. and then charging picked back up. In fact, it spiked once at 7 p.m. and then later at 11 o'clock. So a lot of customers choosing to charge their vehicles overnight. This one on the right comes from that Austin Energy program I was mentioning. The charging behavior here was really interesting, and importantly, it was very consistent from weekdays to weekends. So the behavior was avoiding the peaks, and it tended to not change whether it was kind of Monday through Friday versus a Saturday or a Sunday. There's a really interesting study. Unfortunately, at this point it's 10 years old. It'd be nice for, I think, somebody to try and look at this again, maybe with some new elements to it. But this is for a San Diego Gas and Electric rate. It was not the one I had showed you. It was a different one. It was a time of use rate, and they actually offered 3 different peak to off-peak ratios in the summer. And you can see them here. They had a high, medium, and a low, which corresponded on the top right to a 6-to-1 or 4-to-1 or a little bit less than a 2-to-1 peak to off-peak ratio. And they found a couple of things. One, that higher price ratios, so folks in that 6-to-1 peak to off-peak ratio really it